Soldiers aren't usually associated with scurvy, but soldiers died regularly from scurvy in North America because they're quite often stationed in landlocked areas where they did not have access to fresh food. To give you one example, here is the top image here is what Quebec looked like after the British took it because of the bombarding during the siege. And they only take it in early September, and they move in late September. And this is their housing. And over that winter, they didn't get supplies in before the St. Lawrence froze up. So where you only had some 50-some soldiers die in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, that winter, 600 to 1,000 soldiers died in Quebec through scurvy. They were dying so fast and it was so cold, this was a particularly brutal winter, that they were stacking the dead like cordwood. And you get these stories account about when the snow came off in April and the soldiers were seeing their comrades thawing out, stacked like cordwood, the dead. And just at that moment, the French army comes back to try to retake Quebec. And the soldiers have to check themselves out of the hospital to fight this, and they're described as skeletons. Unsurprisingly, they get defeated. Some 260-some soldiers die in that conflict. But Quebec is not retaken by the French because the British get in and resupply beforehand. But roughly about twice as many soldiers died at Quebec as a result of scurvy and probably pneumonic type diseases as died in the two battles of Quebec. That gives you a scale. You know, and up until the 20th century, more soldiers die from illness and disease than from battlefield conditions, until there's antibiotics. I also look at the Army in the social and cultural context. First thing is the need to engender military history. You know, in the last 20 years, more historians have had more effort at trying to restore women into the story of military history. But at least in this era, there hasn't been a lot done about how gender is deployed by the military. Is a normative view to facilitate the interests of war. So you got representations here of a famous kind of cross-dressing woman who went to war, and then an idealized image of a camp prostitute in a tent there. And a lot of historians pretty much just try to recount that type of history. You know, even John Lennon, in his recent book on this, divides women into harlots and strumpets, I think, and whores, using the terminology of the era to divide them up, which I think diminishes just how crucial they are to making war. The other thing that's not been looked at enough is masculinity. You know, the Army is probably the archetypical masculine institution. It has been since recorded history. And throughout history, there's not that many exemptions to wars are fought by men. It's always been constructed in these terms. In this particular war, you can see gender being used as a normative dividing line between this and that to separate the military from civil society. Civil society is sometimes referred to in feminine terms as opposed to military society. Gender is also deployed to separate you from your enemy. The French are always portrayed as being effeminate in this period. There's even worries that the English aristocracy is becoming too effeminate because they're Frenchified. They speak French, they wear French fashion, and they drink French wine. But within the Army itself, it's also, masculinity is deployed as a means of getting men to fight. Now, if you're only getting 6 pence a day to put your life on the line, you need more kind of an incentive. And offering them this hyper-masculine reputation is one way to get around that. You tell them that they're the most manly of men, the highest of men, Marines. You're going to go in and fight. You still see it operational in advertising now. I call this a psychological wage, taking it from W.E.B. Du Bois. In exchange for their willingness to put their lives on the line, they're given this unreal, intangible sense of self. Doesn't really do anything. self-exploitation. And being more manly, you put yourself at risk. Ethnicity and race are also deployed in warfare. Linda Colley's big book on Britons in the 18th century, she exaggerates just how integrative the notion of Britons is. That she believes that everyone in Scotland and England believed that they were a Briton. If that were true, Scotland wouldn't be voting now to reestablish itself as a nation. And in warfare, I think it does operate on that level, on an overarching level. You make appeals to what the Briton is, to try to get everyone enlisted to a shared purpose. But at the same time, the British also deploy ethnicities to identify martial races under their control. And both the Scottish Highlander and the Irish are often portrayed as martial races that can be sent out and do quite often hand-to-hand combat, particularly with the Scots with the broadsword. They'd be ones that are quite often identified as grenadier type, light infantrymen doing hand-to-hand combat. And in doing this, what you're doing is, again, you're giving them a kind of ethnic psychological wage. You're the most martial of warriors, but you're going to die more in the process of fulfilling that identity. So ethnicity is not just used to differentiate between enemy and yourself, but it's deployed in an imperial setting to identify groups and use them to the advantage of the imperial enterprise. Same can be said here of Native Americans too. Although they were a very difficult group of people to deal with because they were adroit at playing one side off against the other. And very slippery as allies, but also very dangerous as foes. I talk about the society that gets constructed in military camps, which are called the soldiering community, and there you have soldiers, you will have the women who follow the army, you'll have civilian sutlers, civilian laborers, you will have, and depending upon the situation, you may have local people settled in the area that move through, you have people who are supplying supplies, provisions, you have Native Americans who are coming through camp all the time. So what you have in some of these settings is like a microcosm of the Atlantic world. People moving around the world, and it just happened it's taking place on the frontier in Pennsylvania or on the frontier in New York. And the question is, why are all these people there at that moment in time? Why is it in their interest to be there? And that's why I think you have to think more critically about warfare as a human phenomenon to explain why these people arrived here at this moment in time to be doing what they're doing. On to combat. In writing this, I've broken it up into two chapters, and first is trying to conceive what it was like to go into battle knowing that you can be killed or not be killed, and just what it was like, and trying to get at the actual experience. There's not a lot of records from the war that speak to what it was like. In a lot of soldiers' journals across time, there's a lot of repression of the experience of combat that goes on, particularly one's own activity in killing. But what you get is classic sense of the absolute chaos, the danger there, and best not to move or else, because if you put your head above the log, you may be shot in the head. There's a lot of fear there, and all the things that are done to try to get men to that point, the training that goes on, trying to dehumanize the enemy, trying to facilitate them killing them. And a topic that I just came to last year or so is I started reading studies on psychological combat trauma, most of which was written on 20th century warfare, and it really flows out of the Vietnam War experience and then later got applied back to World War I. And it really resonated with me in my understanding of this war, particularly the Vietnam connotations. You're talking about a lot of the war in some of these wars, guerrilla warfare. It's asymmetrical. A lot of it's carried out in heavily wooded terrain, and there's a lot of ambush tactics going on. The diagnostics for psychological combat trauma and then also for PTSD, point to witnessing unusual or extreme violence being committed to someone you know or close to you, seeing desecration of bodies, body mutilations, trophy taking, those sorts of things. And this often precipitates, which John Shea, who's written on the Vietnam War experiences, is a kind of berserk phase where you go out and recapitulate the same thing again. You start committing the same sort of atrocities. And I found this all very interesting, but and I thought I would love to connect it back to the 18th century, but it's a hard thing to do because you can't psychoanalyze these people. They didn't leave a lot of records speaking to their feelings about it. But what I thought you could do is track out an actual experience, things that happen, see if they fit the diagnostics for combat psychological trauma, and then you might be able to draw a connection to it, an inference. And I decided to look at the Siege of Quebec. And I have an image here of Fort William Henry, because Fort William Henry plays a big role in what happens at the Siege of Quebec. It's the massacre that takes place after the French take William Henry. Last of the Mohicans is based upon this. The amount of people killed has been exaggerated. Ian Steele says, but there's still a lot of people killed, and it becomes a cause célèbre. It's seen as an atrocity akin to My Lai, something to that extent. And there's propaganda that's circulating, and when the British get to Quebec and land, June 27, 59, what they meet there is a British soldier who's been impaled on a stake and beheaded. And the natives and the French have done this as a kind of body mutilation mourning. And what starts happening within a day of that is that the French and Canadians start sending out scalping parties and hit 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 British troops and scalp them and leave their bodies mutilated to be discovered. And then almost automatically the British start doing the same thing back. So you'll find tit-for-tat things going on within days of each other. It's always back and forth. And when Wolfe lands, and he publishes the manifesto right after the landing, and says that if they practice any of these types of atrocities, like what happened at William Henry, you will feel our bitterest revenge, he says. But it's the soldiers who are driving this initially. And by late July, Wolfe issues an order that says that it's all right to scalp Canadians if they're dressed like Indians. There's an embrace by the military high command to do this. 2 days later, the British try to cross the river and land at Montmorency. They're repulsed, and they have to withdraw and leave their wounded on the shore. When the French and Indians come down and butcher them all, well, the other guys are watching from across the river. Wolfe then takes off the gloves and he starts slashing and burning the entire region. Sends out rangers, Highlanders, light infantrymen to any resistance to just remove it. And this culminates in late August when there's resistance to this one village by 30 French habitants led by a Catholic priest. They're defeated. They try to surrender, and the Highland officer says, "Kill all, give no quarters." So the French priest is massacred right there. This story hasn't been told about the Siege of Quebec. But I think you can see in this cycle of violence, atrocity, body mutilation, indications that there's trauma, psychological trauma that's going on. I looked further on to see whether there's resonances after the war. And in Montreal a year later, when it's already defeated, soldiers are getting into trouble with trying to steal from the French citizenry. And there's one instance where a soldier goes in, they don't have a lot of rations either, so he goes in and steals 7 loaves of bread but decides to kill everyone in the house. And he's taken prisoner and he's asked, "Why did you do this?" And he says, "There's been worse things done than this."